Yo, did you all know that fighting games are pretty sick? Yes, after a month of working on videos, I've come down from my Mount Sinai to proclaim that this genre with international tournaments, with thousands of participants and decades of history, is actually pretty great. And let's not forget about the fantastic community.
Wow! Are you fucking kidding me? Yo, Marvel! Holy shit!
But despite eyeing up the scene for years, I've personally never gotten into fighting games proper. And it's not for lack of trying either. I've put tons of hours into games like Dragon Ball FighterZ, Street Fighter V, MVC3, and while I've gotten a decent grasp on them, I've always felt like I was missing something that kept me from getting fully absorbed into them like I felt I could. I even got a fight stick because I like to feel nostalgic for an era that I was only around for the end of. I mean, because it allows me to input motions better. The best way to explain it would probably be that there's a difference between understanding something, appreciating it, and truly getting it. And I've always been firmly stuck on that second stage. But then on a laugh, I picked up Power Rangers Battle for the Grid on a sale because a few friends recommended it as a fun Marvel vs. Capcom style tag team fighter. And something just clicked.
Oh my god. I get it. I get it.
Where before I might only play a fighting game for a couple hours outside of the occasional matches with friends, I'm now taking characters to the lab to better understand them, I'm studying movesets and researching tech. When I'm bored of doing work at my desk, I'm jumping online for a few ranked matches, which I've rarely committed to in the past. I've even booked my tickets to EVO. Oh no. Now, to be fair, a few of you are probably looking at the footage on screen and going, what in the fuck are you talking about? This game looks poverty as hell. Might as well be playing Dong Dong Never Dies. And honestly, if you talked to me about a year ago, I would have been right there with you. When Battle for the Grid first launched, I completely dismissed it as a lame cash grab using recycled models from Enway's previous free-to-play mobile game. And it didn't help that its god-awful launch only reaffirmed those feelings. No story mode, no lobby system, a 9-character roster with no voiceovers, and janky gameplay being held together by duct tape and a piece of Wrigley's was laughable even at $20, resulting in incredibly mediocre reviews when the game initially dropped. But rather than pack it in and head back to the free-to-play mines, Enway put the time in and kept working to improve the game, all while trying to keep on top of the pro FGC players looking to break the game with as many infinite combo loops like its MVC2. And now, over a year later, after implementing huge sweeping updates to its systems and doubling its character roster, we have one of the funnest tag team fighting games I've played in ages. So I figured since the game is moving into its 3rd season soon, why not take the time to talk about how it made such a turnaround, why I fell so hard for it, and why this might be one of the best games for new fighting game players to get into right now. And let's start by addressing the biggest selling point right out of the gate. Now, sure, if you told 9-year-old Fox that he would one day be able to play a fighting game where he could call in the Megazord to commit a war atrocity on his opponent, or main Lord Zed, it would have blown his tiny child mind. However, while I grew up with the original series, even having my own copies of the Green with Evil VHSs, I gradually fell off the series by around Lost Galaxy, meaning I don't have a lot of personal attachment for a large portion of the game's roster. So despite this game being marketed as a giant send-up to the Power Rangers series, down to the menu music being a metal cover of the original theme song, when I say I love how 90% of the characters play, no, it's not just nostalgia-tinted goggles yearning for a time where the biggest issue I had was which cool lunchbox I should get, and not the world perpetually being on fire. I mean, sure, one of the 3 preset teams I use the most is made up entirely of Mighty Morphin characters, but that has more to do with how they play and their team composition over who they are specifically, outside of maybe Zed. I just really like Zed.
Oh, Alpha, you can come out of hiding.
I don't like you, Ed.
It's Zed, you blinking bucket of bolts! Lord Zed!
What I'm saying here is that you don't have to have an attachment to Power Rangers to enjoy Battle for the Grid, because the game underneath that veneer of 90s Sentai nostalgia is what really carries it. For those unaware, Battle for the Grid is a classic 3v3 tag team fighter like MVC3 or Skullgirls. So you have light, medium, heavy, and special attacks, and 2 buttons for calling an assist that you can then tag in proper to switch over to. Altogether, it's pretty straightforward, which is actually the game's biggest strength. It boils down everything to be as simple and accessible as possible, while keeping the door open for more advanced tech as you learn it. Nearly every character has built-in auto combos coming off their light, medium, and heavy attacks, which typically end in a knockdown state, making it easy for beginners to get a feel for the game when first getting into it. And you can get pretty far with that if you understand at least the fundamental systems and how to read what your opponent's doing. But to get the most out of the game's combat, you need to realize how to actually avoid using those enders that slam the enemy to the ground by switching between different attacks and specials that make them last. And that's where the enjoyment of cracking into the game for real can start. The moment I realized that Tommy's cannon drill used for closing gaps could be chained into a dive kick from the air in order to continue a combo, thus becoming the first piece to figuring out a decent bread and butter combo, was like the monkeys in 2001: A Space Odyssey discovering the monolith for the first time. Because it's here that I realized the sheer satisfaction of learning how to piece individual moves together to start making proper combo chains, and exploring the unique mechanics of each character. But before we start getting too deep into this all, it's important to acknowledge that this game isn't exactly breaking new ground in this regard. Fighting games have always been a genre built by iterating on what its predecessors did, and in that way, Battle for the Grid is plainly sampling from multiple franchises to form its identity, with Marvel vs. Capcom being a transparent influence on the game's style. Which could be because when no one was looking, a cabal of MVC players snuck into the development team with their infinites and DHCs so that they could design their own game. They were asked when's Marvel one too many times, and they finally responded, now. For real though, I'm not joking when I say MVC vets had a clear hand in this game, as Daniel Maniago, better known in the FGC as Clockwork, is the game's lead combat designer, along with other MVC vets like Justin Wong, Shady K, and Yipes acting as consultants on the development, which you can really feel from how it plays. Compared to MVC or Dragon Ball FighterZ, Battle for the Grid might be a more ground-heavy tag team fighter, feeling closer to the weight of something like Mortal Kombat, so you aren't soaring into the air during extended combos, but it's definitely a hyper fighter at heart once you get familiar with it and start learning how to utilize mechanics. And if anything, the weight of the game makes it feel less overwhelming for new players attempting to get into it, as you aren't getting blasted into the ceiling while the camera is fighting to keep track of it all. As a massive MVC send-up though, being able to force your opponent into the wall is still the name of the game, because using wall and ground bounces is how you extend combos in almost all cases, especially since the game has internal limiters for how many launchers, bounces, staggers, and juggles can be done in a single combo before your opponent jumps out of it to prohibit how long someone can manhandle you for. Though that isn't going to stop players from experimenting to create near-infinite combo strings that look like the Navier or Stokes equation, which still fit within those limitations. So it would be great to have some form of combo breaker system like Killer Instinct or Mortal Kombat X built in, just to avoid getting stomped by someone who got you into their one perfectly practiced bread and butter combo that does 80% damage. For what it's worth, however, a fighting game isn't solely defined by its combos, but also by its functions. With Battle for the Grid acting as a massive crossover game for Power Rangers, the game takes from multiple series across the franchise to fill out its roster, which allows for greater diversity in the types of characters to play than if it's solely pushed on the OG series nostalgia that most players would likely be banking on. So you have someone like Dragon Armor Trini, who is your heavy grappler with a couple of beam attacks for range control that's good for damage. Cat from SPD's a straightforward rushdown style character for sheer aggressive combo ability. And then there's big brain characters like the Quantum Ranger from Time Force, whose moveset's full of teleporting mix-ups and zoning tactics that make them tough to handle if you learn how to use them right.
I need more quantum power.
If I'm being honest, there aren't many characters on the roster I can't get some level of enjoyment playing. Even Goldar and the Magna Defender, whose movesets I typically wouldn't jive with for being so bulky, I can get something out of, which speaks for how well the roster has been balanced as it was being developed when it comes to how its characters were designed. Each one of them has something to provide if you're willing to experiment, which is why when you go online, you can find a decent variety in the matches you find. Admittedly, there is plenty of team overlap, as Trini and Ranger Slayer's assists are really appealing as combo extenders, and the meta currently favors fast, aggression-heavy characters. But if you look at the top 10 of the leaderboard for the last league season, there are only 3 characters out of the entire roster never used once. And I'd argue that's partly because Daichi is such a billion IQ character to use properly, being this weird mix of Black Panther from MVC Infinite and Akuma from Street Fighter. Since this is a tag team fighter though, it's not just about the individual characters, but how they're put together. Meaning thought has to go into how your team's made up. When I originally started playing, I mostly focused on characters I thought were cool, like the Green Ranger and Doggy. But then I realized it's just as important knowing which characters complement each other. You learn quickly that characters like Mastodon Sentry work best as an anchor due to his assist firing 3 shots along the stage, allowing for easy chip damage and screen cover, so you don't want to put him right at the front of the team. Instead, you want to put someone like Gia or Jen Scott on point so that you can take advantage of their rushdown attacks to put on pressure right from the start of the match. So putting a team together quickly becomes a sort of puzzle where you're optimizing what you like in a character with how well they work together on a team, experimenting to see which characters complement each other. Even during my work on this video, I ended up revamping my main team because I discovered how much I like Jen Scott's close range versatility when it came to making combos, which covered for Mastodon and Zed's weaker points. My favorite aspect of the game's tag team system though is how the actual takeover mechanic works. Rather than having assists and tag-ins be 2 separate functions like most team fighters, Power Rangers has an interesting approach where they operate on the same input. So you're actually swapping characters midway through their assist attacks, both making tagging in characters significantly easier in most cases since they're coming in attacking, and still allowing for really inventive combo systems to develop. This approach creates a great midpoint between a traditional tag system where assists come in having startup time before they're able to attack, and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite's active switch system where tagged in characters come in attacking, because it's here where the player has a ton of control over how the system's used. Since the devs have opened up the time frame in the assist animations where players can do a takeover, even allowing characters to be tagged in after their assists were already stopped by an opponent's attack, the ability to swap over mid-assist means being able to decide exactly how you want to place yourself when you change over, depending on how you've placed yourself, allowing for creative ways to build assists into combos, and some really cool cross-up tech if you know the spacing of attacks. One tactic I love doing with this is using moves that place myself on the other side of the opponent from where my assist is coming out, so I can throw them off when I actually swap over to a new character and start attacking from the other side. It's those kind of mind games that this system's perfectly made for. But in talking about this whole puzzle of combos and characters, a key thing we have to address is how the game actually controls. Fighting games have always been defined by the unique way they handle, and how that influences their design. And that's a major reason why Battle for the Grid originally caught my eye, because it's built on having simplified controls. That meaning, no motion inputs. All special attacks are done solely through directional inputs similar to Smash Bros. Oh shit, does that mean this isn't a fighting game anymore? For those that might not know what I'm specifically talking about because you're actually productive with your time, if you want to do Trey's Gold Rush attack shown here, it just takes pressing forward and the special button. None of this technical nonsense here. Just nice and straightforward controls. This design even carries over to the EX attacks and supers, acting on their own dedicated buttons rather than being tethered to unique inputs, making it significantly simpler to integrate them into combos if you get the timing right, or to take advantage of the fact that they're invincible on startup to break out of a tough spot. And I'm sure for any experienced player listening, this is probably coming off as, "Wah, I don't want to learn how to do motions, baby wants simple inputs." And yeah, you're right. I'm not going to deny that. What, you're telling me I'm supposed to practice to get skilled at a competitive game? One of the biggest frustrations I've had learning fighting games is getting good at being able to execute persistent move inputs to do things like supers without completely dropping a combo and making it easy for my opponent to read what I'm trying to do, and is still something I struggle with today. But with your support, maybe one day I can get the help I need. Until then, however, I really appreciate having a tag team fighter like Battle for the Grid that boils down its button layout so it removes any complications with its inputs. Because when players don't have to worry about doing Z motions or what directions their half circles are going to get the full use of a character, they can focus on getting a grasp of the actual fundamentals and how to make the most of their team's toolset much quicker, which is where the actual enjoyment of experiencing fighting games comes from. Of course, I understand why longtime fighting game players are apprehensive of having simplified systems like this. Making fighting games more accessible has always been something long-running series have grappled with, since opening up the accessibility while not dropping the skill ceiling for high-level play is an incredibly tough balance to maintain. But it's something I'd say Battle for the Grid handles quite well by removing that execution cost. A beginner to the genre could start the game and get a basic grasp of the team within an afternoon in the training room. But when you see what the pros of this game are doing after enough practice, you start to see how much room there still is to be creative and express your own style by using every facet of the game's mechanics, and a big part of that is due to the streamlined control scheme. This obviously isn't to say motion inputs are a bad thing or that they're holding fighting games back, because they clearly have their place, and there is something satisfying in breaking through that barrier of execution. But they can definitely be prohibitive for a lot of players getting in, either due to the sheer time investment of getting to the point where they're second nature, or a general lack of hand dexterity. So having a tag team fighter that allows new players to execute special attacks without spending months in the lab to get a consistent Hadouken out means it can act as a perfect entry point for anyone that's curious about the genre, but doesn't want to jump into the fighting game death pits like UMVC3 or Skullgirls to get a good taste for it. What I'm saying here is, have fun with your shitty pretzel motions, you fuck! Then there's the Megazord Ultras, the game's core comeback mechanic, where you call in one of 3 Zords or a giant Goldar to stomp on your opponent, each with their own unique traits. Originally, the system was going to work similar to an X-Factor style power boost a la MVC3, but the Zords have always been a staple of the Power Rangers franchise, because who doesn't like a good merchandising opportunity? So this was a clever idea for implementing them into the actual gameplay of a traditional fighting game, without it becoming another Mighty Morphin Power Rangers The Fighting Edition. How it essentially works is that the Zord summons only become usable once you've lost a character, which becomes more powerful if you're down to your last. Once called on, you can then order one of 3 attacks, each tied to your light, medium, and heavy inputs, which can then be used up until the meter runs out. And since the player and Zord move independently, you can incorporate their stompings into your combos, as a lot of their attacks cause wall bounces or have OTG properties that send your opponent into the air off the ground. If used well, the Zords can actually turn the tides of a fight going sideways quick. However, unlike a traditional power boost style of comeback system where either player can use it at any given moment, only one Zord can be active at a time, which does complicate things. Delaying using the Ultra till the last minute to guarantee the most damage might read as the optimal way to use it, but that has the downside of your opponent possibly calling in theirs solely to block yours, adding another layer of strategy that has to be factored in as you get to the final moments of a match and the mechanic becomes a final ploy to use. If you're aggressive enough and know when to go for the opening, you can even waste the time of your enemy's Ultra by comboing them so that they never get a real chance to use it after activation, since you have to be able to throw an attack to call in theirs. On the face of it, the Megazord seem like a very basic Unga Bunga comeback system that players can use to smash their opponents down when they're feeling desperate, but it adds an entirely new layer of depth to how the systems work in a way that feels wholly unique, while perfectly fitting the spirit of the series. The thing is though, the Zord Ultra mechanic is planned to be changed slightly in the next major update. Going by the wording on Battle for the Grid's website, the Ultras are no longer going to be earned by losing a character, but instead by taking damage to build up a revenge meter, making it sound like it's going to operate similar to Street Fighter 4's revenge gauge. Now of course, I wanted to wait until the 3.0 update so I could talk about these changes proper and how it might affect the flow of matches, but it was delayed by at least 3 weeks as of writing this due to extenuating circumstances, which I would have waited for, except the Steam Summer Sale currently going on where the game is half off would have been over by then, which I've likely already missed due to struggling with my own creative anxieties when working on videos. And I've spent weeks working on this video because making content's the only way I can feel productive in this current nightmare world I exist in that causes me endless stress. And I can quite literally feel this entire section becoming more and more relevant as I speak. Anyways, because I'm me, we're gonna have to address the game's story mode, despite knowing talking about fighting game campaigns is like nails on a chalkboard for most FGC players. For anyone who isn't familiar, the story mode for Battle for the Grid was written as an adaptation of the Shattered Grid story arc by Boom Studios, a multimedia comic event done to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the original series. So if you're wondering why the roster so heavily leans on the Mighty Morphin characters, even though it's intended to be a series crossover, or how Trini got mecha armor, that's why. The Shattered Grid arc centers on a comic-unique villain, Lord Draken, an evil alternate reality version of Tommy Oliver who conquered Earth after defeating the Rangers, who's attempting to break reality by stealing Power Ranger morphers from every series so that he can tap into the Morphin Grid, the source for power for all Rangers across the franchise, causing the timeline to fracture and multiple teams having to work together to stop him. You know, your standard crossover affair. Honestly, if you have any interest in the story mode of this game, or just a more mature take on the original series, I'd highly recommend checking out Boom Studios' Comic Run, if not at least the Shattered Grid storyline. Beautiful artwork, fight scenes and designs that aren't restricted to old Sentai footage, a massive sense of scale, and a fun tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of the campy 90s feel of the original series makes for a pretty enjoyable read. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the game's version of it though. Granted, Kyle Higgins, the head writer from Boom Studios who was tasked with putting together the story mode, did his best to make what he had work, still hitting a lot of the major beats of the comic. But due to a lack of characters, stages, and the budget of a chicken quesadilla combo with a Baja Blast, corners had to be cut here and there for adapting the storyline, which drastically brings down the spectacle of it all. The characters don't go into space to fight a war on the moon with all their Zords, the weight of character deaths are drastically reduced due to a lack of context involved, you don't actually see the damage Lord Draken has done to the timeline because you only see a few backdrops for stages and a rough handful of rangers from other series, and if someone isn't part of the roster, they aren't even shown, outside of Dr. K, Rita Repulsa, and a couple of rangers seen in illustrated story scenes. Also, since the campaign came out shortly after the initial release, the pool of characters you end up playing as or fighting against are from a pool of about 11 characters, so you start to learn the matchups for fighting against Mastodon sentries real quick.
It's after curfew.
Yeah, I'm just gonna sidestep that one. Plus, it's extremely rare that fights in the story mode are a proper 3v3 match. Rather, one or two characters are given multiple life pools to fight with, meaning you don't get to use or fight against a full team. Having the occasional 1v1 or 1v2 matches during the game does work narratively for the framing of characters being put into a vulnerable position, but it also starts to take away from where the gameplay really shines. So as it is, the story mode works best as an advertisement for a better comic series rather than being its own self-contained story. That said, it's not the most offensive story mode I've encountered, if not just a little low budget.
Hey guys, it's good to see you.
You too, man. You too.
A half-decent story mode does not a good fighting game make, however. What does make a good fighting game is, say it with me, solid online match connections. Despite being a genre dedicated to players being able to fight against each other, for years, trying to get a fighting game that worked well online has been something that the community has been struggling with, whether that's bad lobby systems or terrible netcode, to the point that it's ruined otherwise fantastic games in the eyes of an already niche fanbase. Nowadays, a fighting game can live or die based on its online. So before I go any further, I'm gonna reiterate again that Battle for the Grid is sold for $20 and was made on a shoestring budget. I don't bring this up as a way to deflect issues here, but to illustrate how impressive what it's doing is. Because not only does Battle for the Grid allow for crossplay across all platforms that it's currently on, so if you want to get the game on a Steam sale, you aren't locked from playing with your friends on the PS4 or the Stadia, it also uses rollback netcode for its online matchmaking. Now, as established, I'm a fighting game brainlet. I'm not Maximilian Dude or Core Gaming, so I'm not the person to go to for an extensive breakdown of why every fighting game should be using rollback netcode over delay-based. But to put it as simply as possible, this means when connecting to someone for a match, you aren't dealing with extreme input lag and characters teleporting around the stage, which is becoming ever more essential as fighting games have moved further and further to online. We're no longer able to go to arcades for tournaments for one reason or another, so we should have fighting games that have reliable connections for matches and lobbies, especially in a genre of game reliant on having exact timing to responses. This can only be good for fighting games going forward, and it's nuts that this Power Rangers game is helping to set that standard over series that have been around for decades like Street Fighter. A fighting game that plays complete cross-platform with fantastic netcode, that's literally never happened before. And from a game that costs less than your average slow cooker if you aren't picking up the DLC characters. A game made in Unity using tech from a gacha game is dunking on legacy fighting game titles that have infinitely bigger budgets. Now, that isn't to say that everything Battle for the Grid does is perfect, because it absolutely is not. As I said, it took over a year to get it to the stage it's at now. And while I applaud the fact that the devs have implemented so much feedback from the community, rivaling No Man's Sky for comeback of the decade, there are still some rough patches that are keeping it from hitting the highs that it very well could reach. For example, while the online netcode is strong during matches, the stability can be as fragile as my ego while writing scripts. So there's a problem of occasionally dropping connections altogether due to server issues. Real talk, nothing is more infuriating when you're having a good match than getting slammed with a connection loss message. It's fighting game blue balls. From what I've read up on, it seems that the devs are aware of the issue, but current world situations have made fixing larger server issues significantly harder. Also, while I'm pointing out gripes, I'll own up to the fact that the game still isn't the prettiest fighter to look at, and that isn't likely to be fixed anytime soon. This issue comes across most clearly with the attack animations, namely with the supers. While most supers in the game have good utility in the matches themselves, they aren't all that satisfying to actually see executed like the ones in, say, Ultra Street Fighter 4, unless they're meant to be the punctuation to a lengthy combo, and that's more from the satisfaction of getting that last big hit over the super itself. I know that that's the most superficial thing to complain about, but when a game is homaging MVC, a series with some of the raddest looking attack animations, that's only a fair critique. Of course, I'm not expecting Arx's level production value from a poverty fighting game, but even MVC Infinite, for all its faults, had some creative and inventive visuals for its supers. Part of Battle for the Grid's issue is lack of movement and impact in the animations, and the rest is due to its use of flat angles during cinematics. What's Gia's super, for example? A big slash that slowly moves across the screen. Get hype? Even Ranger Slayers, which was improved from a visual standpoint compared to how it originally looked when the game first dropped, ends on a wet fart of a note. Seriously, in a series known for having massive pyrotechnics when someone transforms or gets hit by a big attack, how isn't there more theatrics during the win screens or for supers that get the final KO? Anyway, come on, this is just free. Though I will say this game does have one of my favorite supers possibly ever with Lord Zed, where he calls in his putties to curb stomp his enemies while he gets hype in his chair, before ending off on letting you know who he is. If every super was even half as good as this, I wouldn't have a problem. Overall, Battle for the Grid isn't exactly reinventing the wheel for fighting games or raising the bar to brand new heights never imagined before, and a lot of the times it's jank as hell. But I'd be patently lying if I said I didn't have a blast playing it. And it's made me appreciate the genre in a way I never thought I could. Even with its transparent flaws, I genuinely adore this game. It might sound crazy to some, but if I'm getting wrecked like Graham Linehan on Twitter and still having a fun time, the game's clearly doing something right. Fighting games are so much more than just having two characters beating each other senseless. They're about refining your skills by training to understand all the different facets of the game before taking what you've practiced on into matches to see how you hold up in the heat of battle. There's something so primal about testing your skills against others and learning how you can improve from it, whether it's observing what worked for you or noticing what the other person did better, with that rush of seeing yourself improve by executing that combo you've spent hours piecing together and perfecting. For some, learning this came from the trial by fire era of the 90s arcades. For others, it was something like Dragon Ball FighterZ or Killer Instincts that drew them in. And for me personally, it was Power Rangers Battle for the Grid. Admittedly, I don't know how much longer I'll keep working at this game or when I might move on to another fighter, but it's definitely an experience that's made me see things a bit differently, to the point I was willing to spend about a month of research and writing time on it when I could have worked on something people would actually like to see covered. And if that doesn't say a lot, I don't know what else I could say other than maybe I'll see you online.